Thank you. Thank you, Maeve, and the people at the Archives for inviting me to give this talk. I'm especially happy to talk in an archive because of some personal relationship. One of my roommates as an undergraduate became one of the head archivists at the Bentley Library, excuse me, at the University of Michigan. And my son is the digital archivist at the Rockefeller Library in New York. So happy to talk at a real archives. I'm not a historian. You might, I was getting my PhD at NYU, so I dealt with a lot of history, but at the end of the whole process, I'm just not a scholar. I'm just not, I can't see myself teaching for the next 35, 40 years. I got a chance to teach a little at Yale and a little bit at George Washington University. I knew it was probably not for me. So I went into business. I started in DC as a presidential staff member at the Council on Environmental Quality. Kind of went from there. Landed in New Haven, worked for an electric utility. And this really, strangely enough, really morphs into my railroad and came from this story. Because it was a smaller utility, took care of the areas of New Haven, Bridgeport, and like 16 surrounding towns. But it was surrounded by a huge utility. Okay, so I got used to working in an atmosphere of being in a small pond and the ocean around us, and how you deal when you're up against bigger organizations. The CEO, I got my own bio wrong. It wasn't read wrong, it was written wrong. I actually worked for 4 CEOs with special projects because my boss at the Connecticut utility became the CEO of Kansas City Southern in 1991, and then he brought me out there. I was his speech writer, and his wife always would say that I sound more like George Edwards than George Edwards, only nicer. And as their marriage had last, I guess it wasn't that nice. It wasn't that nice. But he got me out there, and he taught me something though. We in Connecticut. This is kind of important for the theme of this book. Owned 20%, 17% at the time, of a nuclear power plant that was being built in New Hampshire. Well, probably most of you remember at that time, nuclear power was a dirty word. And they were getting decommissioned. If they weren't online, they weren't going online. And as a small company, to have a 20%, almost 20% ownership of a nuclear power plant that wasn't going online was disastrous, basically. And he, in the small utility, championed the forces, and Seabrook Station became the last commercial, got the last commercial license for a nuclear power plant until the very recent times. Realize that you can be small and do big things. You just have to have the willpower and the corporate culture where people work together. And so with Pat Ottensmeyer, Pat was the last CEO of Kansas City Southern, and a very, very, very close friend of mine, which is difficult because Pat died this past July. He came to me in 2017 and said, would I be interested in writing the history of KCS? He said, previous books or previous attempts are unreadable, basically. He would want me to do and specialize, really talk about the last 35 years, because that's when a lot of big things happen at KCS. But I was intrigued by something. And this is really the start of why this book, why I wanted to write this book. There's actually 2 realities that I was looking at. One is Kansas City Southern should never have been built in the first place. It was 1887. The days of the land grant, big railroads, they were gone. Everything was east-west. After the Treaty of Hidalgo, when the U.S. won from Mexico all the western lands, everything was go west, young man. And the railroads were all being built on an east-west axis because that's the way the economy was going to be driven in the United States. And up until very recently, that was the case. Certainly wasn't going north-south, not after the Civil War and everything. Reconstruction was not a great success. And there was already 3 railroads serving north-south. There was the Moab Missouri Pacific. There was, talking about before the Katy, the Kansas, the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas Railway, and the Illinois Central. So, if you think about Kansas City to the Gulf of Mexico, how many commercial centers are on the way? None. You get New Orleans, and that's a nice city, but it's really not a big commercial center. So why build a railroad in the wrong direction at the wrong time with no money? But this fellow, Arthur Stilwell, had a dream of building a railroad. Anyway, that's one reality. You have a railroad, and all through basically its history, KCS was always short on money. Never was wealthy until the very end. And you just wonder why it did that. Okay, the other reality, and I knew this from my days in investor relations, from 1925 to today, basically, even though Kansas City Southern doesn't exist anymore, it was purchased last year by the Canadian Pacific, a study of 29,078 companies was done. What companies offered the best? They ranked all the companies for the best return on railroads over that period of time. All the big ones, all the big companies we know about. Where's KCS in that list? 3rd of that piece of thing. In 2009, I remember this, watching it, CNBC was celebrating, the news network, the business news network, was celebrating their 20th anniversary.
7:11 p.m.
And so they had one of the things they did, they had a panel, and they had, the panelists were asked, what was the most valuable company over that 20-year span for shareholder returns? Of course, all the typical ones, you hear about Exxon, General Motors, Microsoft. Well, it was Kansas City Southern. Then the third thing, a research firm called Seeking Alpha, it's a financial research firm, did a study in 2016. And they were looking backwards, and what they said, if somebody bought $100 worth of stock in Kansas City Southern in 1974 and just forgot about it, and then picked it up in 2016 and say, hey, I wonder how much this, is it worth $50 now, $200 now? If they checked then, it was worth $1.7 million. So I'm saying to myself, how do these things go together? Railroad going in the wrong direction with no customers, no money for construction, become this miraculous financial success at the end. And so that's what I wanted to write the story about, trying to answer that question for myself. What seems to be this, really the answer starts with what I kind of was talking about, the utility in Connecticut. Culture is so important. I'm sure all of you have worked various places, and if you work at the archives, the Missouri State Archives has a corporate culture here. It's just different, and that'll be different than the Bentley or archives around. It's a unique. Everyone has their unique way of looking at the same thing sometimes. And so when I was looking at my experience at the Kansas City Southern culture, it's like we had no fear. You know, UP with their 32,000 miles, us with our 3,000 miles, so what? We can take you on. And our BNSF is 32,500. Yeah, so what? So it's kind of a fearlessness, but also when you're small, you have to be nice. You don't have the luxury of saying, you do it our way. You know, we offer a service and you conform to that service. At KCS, even all through the history that I worked there, we had to work with our customers. We had to say, well, what do you need? And try to tailor as much as we could the service to that. How to be entrepreneurial. No money, but we had big plans. Well, how do you do that? You know, so you think of ways to do it. And I'll talk about that in a few minutes and some examples of that. And so you have to think in two ways. You're no worse, maybe even better than the big guys, and you think big. How can you really achieve success? At the same time, you have to work with people. You have to be conscious of their needs. My mentor was the fellow at the electric utility who went to Kansas City Southern, George Edwards. He taught me, he said, Bill, you know, it's hard to hate a company if you like the people who work at that company. And that was something I always stressed to the people who worked for me, because we had to deal with a lot of hedge funds, a lot of 20-something punks who thought they, you know, were God's gift to the universe, and would show you that, be nice, just wow them with love and talk about them behind their back, yeah, but you know, be kind and nice. That's the way, you know, we looked at business, to just be nice to your competitors, your customers, whatever, and do the best you can. So Arthur Stillwell is rightfully called the founder of Kansas City Southern. Interestingly, he never worked one day for a company called Kansas City Southern. He ended up building the Kansas City, Pittsburgh, and Gulf from Kansas City down to Port Arthur. And then he lost out. He was kicked out of office by New York money. I'll talk a bit about that in a second. But anyway, he was not a railroad person at all. He started really his professional career was started in Hartford, Connecticut for the Travelers Insurance Company. Really an interesting character. I'm sorry that not more studies have been done of him, because he was like a split personality. On one hand, he believed in the Gilded Age, the railroad barons, the American dream of anybody can succeed, self-made man. I'm reading something, one of the things he started, so the company had no money, so he constantly had to have these promotion schemes coming up. So in Independence, Missouri, he built a rail line, it was more trolley than train, but it was a rail line from Kansas City to Independence. Well, you know, most of you have probably been to Independence, and there's not a real attraction for going to Independence it's kind of nice now, the center, but back then there wasn't much there. So he built a park, really an amusement park, and had Chautauqua lectures there, you know, those kind of fun games, religious meetings, political discussions. William Jennings Bryan would come to talk. Well, one of the speakers was somebody called Roger Kroll, and he gave this lecture over 6,000 times in his life, called the Acres of Diamonds. Let me just read a couple of sentences from this. I say that you ought to get rich, and it is your duty to get rich. The men who get rich may be the most honest men you find in the community. Let me say here clearly, 98 out of 100 of the rich men of America are honest. That is why they are rich. That is why they are trusted with money. Well, it's a little hard to accept that these days, but Stillwell believed it, and it was, it was a very common feeling that the rich were rich because they were the best, basically, and we should all strive to get there. And he believed that, and he was successful. At the Travelers, the president of the company said, you stick around here, you're going to be president one of these days. But then the other side of his personality would take over. He was a spiritual kind of guy. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who we all know from Sherlock Holmes, wrote 2 huge volumes on spiritualism. And when Sir Conan Doyle was in the United States lecturing, he said, Arthur Stillwell is the foremost spiritualist in America right now. And Stillwell would write about his business decisions were made because the fairies would come to him at night and kind of like the brownies from Scotland would talk to him and kind of guide his decision-making kind of thing. But he was also a real humanitarian. He was a Christian Scientist. He belonged to the Christ Church Scientists. And Christian Scientist doctrine does not believe that the material world is real. The only reality is a spiritual world. I'm not going to get into existential religion discussions right now, but basically, and I've known quite a few Christian Scientists, and they're just incredibly interesting and nice people because they really kind of believe in working hard, being entrepreneurial, making money, but they give away a lot of money too. Because ultimately, fine, succeed, but your real life is more spiritual. And so when Stillwell died, even though he owned 100 businesses, built the railroad, when he died, he had $1,000, which in the 20s, it's a lot more than it is today, but still was not a lot of money. He was no robber baron. And he formed the corporate culture of Kansas City Southern that lasted for 136 years. And that was work hard, win, succeed, but don't depend on money. And don't have money be your goal. And it's amazing how many of our CEOs live like that. And I'll soon talk about 2 of them. And so I'm not even going to talk too much about the building of the railroad, but about what went into his culture. What were the things that meant something to Arthur Stillwell? Well, he built the railroad because he felt the farmers of Missouri, Kansas, Iowa, and Nebraska were being ripped off by the big railroads. And that was his main reason. He said, especially for export grain, we'll go from the Midwest to the Gulf, ship it off to Europe. He started a freighting company that would take the grain to Europe. And under charge for what Missouri Pacific, Union Pacific were charging to go to the coast. He got a lot of money from the Dutch. He financed, and the Dutch financed a number of the U.S. railroads. But he always stayed very close to the Dutch people, and a number of Dutch farmers were having trouble making it in Holland. And he invited them to move to the United States and to Nederland, Texas. And he said, I'll start a rice farm company for you. And the growth had started off, I think I wrote it down here. In 1889, when he started the company, Texas had only 20 acres of rice fields and produced 14,000 pounds of rice a year. In 10 years under Stilwell, it was 5,700 acres and produced really 195,000 pounds of rice. So he would produce these things, but it was really some was to get money for his railroad, but also for the people of the area. One of the most outstanding things, and I read this because people at Kansas City Southern never knew this until I started doing the investigation. Those of you who know Kansas City at all know about the bottoms, the West Bottoms, and it's lower part of the city, and became popular when really African Americans were brought to the country to build Hannibal Bridge, and well, not the Hannibal Bridge, the bridge into Kansas City. And they lived there. And then over the years, other immigrant groups grew, Germans, Irish, Italians, and it became a huge slum and with disease and everything else. Well, the Dutch were so happy with Stilwell, they gave him a gift of $40,000. He said, well, I don't take people's money, but he took it to start a night school, really a daycare center, and a place where, especially where women could go with children and leave their children. Also, the women could work. Also, to teach jobs that they could be hired for in the city. And also the kids could go to school. And he comments about this at the end. He said, it often seems to me that if nothing else had come out of the building of Kansas City Southern, but the redemption of Hell's Half Acre, that was the Bottoms, and the diversion of so many lives to the right channels, it would have been worth a while. In other words, it wasn't money for him, it was the common good. So this is the guy who started the corporate culture that we live by. I'm going to fast forward to 1961, where if Still was a care was unique, William Doremus III was uniquer, and not necessarily in always the nicest way in the world. But by 1960, the U.S. rail system, freight rail system, was going down the tubes. Two main reasons for that. The Interstate Commerce Act of 1887 regulated the industry. Needed it because of the robber barons, just the monopolies were ripping off people in business and consumers. And so they made it a very regulated industry. For instance, let's say you're moving something from Kansas City to Dallas. Let's say it cost, they would set the rate, $1,000. Didn't matter if Kansas City Southern moved it, whether UP moved it, whether Santa Fe moved it, it was $1,000. That was it. Okay. But what happens, when things change, when there's something called trucks come along who are not regulated the same way and can do it cheaper? Well, the rails are out of luck. So in the 1920s, the railroads had 75% of the business. Trucks had 25%. Fast forward, and then even in the 50s, the railroads had about, in the 40s, had about 3 times more than the trucks. Come to the 70s, trucks have over 50% more of the business than railroads. It's because of a number of things. Dwight Eisenhower, and everyone in this room has benefited from this because this is a good thing, had passed the Highway Act. the Interstate and Defense Highway Act in 1956. He had been the supreme commander of the Allied forces in World War II and became enamored with the German railways, highway system. So he did in the United States. It shaped the United States that we know, basically, and getting around. But it almost destroyed the railroad industry. Trucks were given an infrastructure, while rails had to build a track, maintain the tracks, and everything else. Plus, they were unregulated, so they could charge to the market, either up or down, depending on market conditions. Railroads are going downhill. Well, when Doremus is an interesting guy. He went to the University of Michigan, got a degree in business, then a law degree from Harvard, but then went into railroads. And he became CEO of the Chicago Great Western, and then CEO of the Katy, both of which were in terrible financial shape. And he just slashed everything to the bone. He could be very, very cruel. One day, it was in St. Louis. Katy employees showed up at work. The doors were locked. There were 155 people said, well, if you want to work, you have to move within 48 hours to Denison, Texas. And if you don't do that, you're gone. That was the kind of guy he could be. He could be harsh. Well, he finally got to KCS in 1961. And I was talking to a kind of the most well-known rail journalist, Fred Fraley, and he asked me, he said, do you think Doremus gave up on the railroad industry? And I said, yeah, he did kind of. But he loved Kansas City Southern. He just loved his railroad. But it was dying. So he realized the only way you can save the railroad is build a conglomerate of other businesses that were not regulated. So he daily would sit in his office, which was just a mess. As someone described, his furniture in the office is what was left over after everybody else chose their furniture. He had books all over the place on science, psychology, wild animals, zoology, religion, economics, everything. He would all over it. He sat with an old pork pie hat on, chain smoked cigarettes daily, crusty guy, didn't want to talk to people outside. He loved his employees, but outside the company, he had no use to. One day there was a testimonial dinner for him in Kansas City, and people got up saying all the wonderful things he did for the city and philanthropic and social cause. And they ended it, about 10 people talked, and they asked him to say a few words. He said, I don't give speeches, this night has gone on for too long. He walked away. And, as a public company, you have to have an annual meeting. And it's really not good form for the CEO to walk out midway through the whole thing. But he said, I have work to do. I'm not going to do this anymore. I just sit around and talk. So he was not the easiest guy. But if he wasn't brilliant, he lived right next door. And so he said, I have to come up with some businesses that aren't regulated, too regulated, and are not so reliant on economic conditions. So he decided on 3 fields: communications, pharmaceuticals and healthcare, and financial services and financial products. Well, look at the Wall Street Journal tomorrow. See how many articles you can read on all that stuff. He did this in 1960. He said, these are the ones we're going to go after. These are the ones we're going to create or buy or whatever. His first purchases were right here, Jefferson City, TV station and radio station. He also bought the same in Sedalia and then in Peoria, Illinois. Because he said, look at TV's taking over the news, Sports suddenly is on TV. And what happens when there's an economic downturn? People don't go out to dinner. People don't go out to the movies. People don't go out to plays or things. They stay home and watch TV, advertising, and so he got into that. Then he took one step further to fiber optics. KCS then became one of the big fiber optics movers in the 60s, finally joining Williams Communications, which had one of the 3 national fiber optic systems in the country. So that was one success that he created. In the pharmaceuticals, had some success in generic drugs, but it cost millions, billions to put out new drugs, and we didn't have the money to do that. Modern success, but in terms of health services, did that. Started a company called Argus, which exists, still successful today, and that is the best way to describe it. When you go to the drugstore or wherever you go to get your drugs, prescriptions, it's all computerized. Well, Argus kind of started that, and that became part of Kansas City Southern. The other one was financial services. On the railroad board of directions. Sorry for my listening. No, that's okay. John Hawkinson was considered one of the fathers of the mutual fund industry, and he was on the board of directors of Kansas City Southern. And I remember my father bought me in the 1960s a mutual fund. I had no idea what a mutual fund is. But they became very popular, too popular. There was no back office, there was no accounting that could keep up with people buying and selling. And they went downhill after that because of customer service. Hawkinson said, one of the meetings, I don't know what we're going to do. Well, Doremus said, hey, the railroad has a computer system. Why don't you use that? And basically, his computer people and the railroad's computer people worked together and created what became the back office, the accounting system for the whole mutual fund industry. Also started a company called DST, which still exists today in Kansas City, which was for a while the largest private back office firm that handled mutual funds. And think about mutual funds. If you are getting paid to process sales and buys and sells, you don't care whether somebody's buying or selling because you get paid for each one. It was like a perfect way to make money, down whether the economy is good or bad. So Doremus really did that. Then we bought this little company out in Colorado called Janus Capital. And Janus, by 1999, 2000, was the biggest selling mutual fund in the world. And so suddenly you start saying, wait a minute, the cash register is starting to take off. Now, Doremus bought, his motivation was in part to save the railroad. Not too much money went to the railroad, but I actually worked for the holding company, so I was working with I was mostly doing railroad stuff, but I was working with all the other businesses too. What I realized is the shareholders were happy because they're getting money. Our financial services was worth 96.5% of the worth of the company. Railroad was only worth 3.5 at that time. So, but they were spun off. Then suddenly, the world changed. Suddenly, Janus got into legal problems, and mutual funds went downhill for a while. At the same time, the railroads became much less regulated. The Staggers Act of 1980 kind of freed the railroad to be more competitive. And so it was like perfect. As one died, the other one picked up. And quickly, talking about the third person, who was still somebody who I, whether I want to or not, speak to daily, and that was Mike Haverty. Mike was a railroad guy, and he was president. He grew to become president of the Santa Fe. While he was there, he fell in love with the possibility of Mexico. And NAFTA was just getting started, and he went down there, and he said, this is where it's going. It's no longer east-west. It's going to be north-south. And so when he came to Kansas City Southern, he said, and we only got to Beaumont, Texas. We didn't get close to the border. He said, we've got to get to Mexico. Got to get to Mexico. First day in his office in May 1995, a Mexican company comes in to talk to him, TMM, Transportación Marítima Mexicana. It was mainly a maritime company, but they say, hey, Mexico is going to privatize their rail system. We need a partner. We need a U.S. partner. The guys had gone to UP, and they said, we don't want to deal with you. And went to Santa Fe, we don't want to deal with you. Well, KCS wanted a partner too to start getting into Mexico. So Haverty immediately joined the partnership. Part of the partnership, he had to buy 49% of something called a Tex-Mex. Tex-Mex is a 157-mile short-line railroad in Texas. And it goes from basically Corpus Christi to Laredo. And people laughed at Kansas City Southern Haverty. You're competing against UP and SP because they were merging UP, SP, and being in Santa Fe. And you bought a 157-mile railroad you don't even connect to? You know, what are you thinking about? Well, Haverty knew what he was going to do. Number one, during the regulatory hearings to approve the UP-SP, the Union Pacific, Southern Pacific merger, he fought it tooth and nail. And he got people very riled up about how customers were going to suffer, service was going to go downhill, and you needed more competition. He knew he wasn't going to beat the merger. The STB, the Surface Transportation Board, was going to vote. But what he wanted was to get either a concession to be able to buy a line to connect from Beaumont to Corpus Christi, or get trackage rights. Well, he got trackage rights. And they were circular, they were imperfect. Trackage rights are what you pay for using somebody else's line. They're not ideal because the dispatch is find the owner. So if I'm Kansas City Southern, I'm going to put my train on, my 3 trains on before I let your train go. And so it's not perfect, and they're expensive. But we suddenly connected to Mexico. And then with that partner, we bid against UP again, for the crown jewel concession from Laredo to the heart of Mexico, where all the automobile plants are, and refineries, and so they don't produce enough grain, so they're a great place to send grain down to. Everyone was sure UP was going to win. I was in Mexico most of the time during those days, and suddenly realized, got some real luck. The Union Pacific and Southern Pacific, maybe some of you may remember, especially your railroad people, had gotten to a real mess. Their system just froze. There was a real problem with consolidating the two. And the pressure on the regulators and politicians and the railroads themselves to make changes in doing that. Well, that is all happening at the time we're going to bid against UP. And UP suddenly realized their attention is not in Mexico at this point. It's on the United States. And so it ends up, by huge surprise, we win the major concession. So we become the first railroad in the world, freight railroad in the world, that operates over two major countries. And that just opens up all sorts of possibilities. Harvard, by the way, this doesn't start. He's wrote me into writing an article which will be coming out soon in Trains magazine because he buys something called the macaroni line. This crazy count from Italy builds a railroad in Texas, and it ends up being owned by the Southern Pacific. And then they are trying, Union Pacific, when they take it over, is trying to abandon it and has to go through regulators. And Haverty convinces the SUV, saying, no, you can't abandon it, you have to demand that they sell it to us. So they do, they have to force to sell it, and it gets us off most of the track and trade. So we are now much more straight line. A lot has to be said for, I haven't stressed really with Doremus and Haverty. Both of them stuck with the idea though. You know, they want to win. They were ruthless, both of them could be. Haverty fired me twice. We're really good friends. He fired me twice. I never lost a day's pay, but you know, there was one time he even had the head of human resources come walk me out. He was so mad at me. I can't even remember what. I wasn't even that concerned because it was so stupid. And the guy comes in and says, walk him out. And the head of human resources, no, Mike, no. And then Mike then gets like, it must have had something to do with marketing because he brought the head of marketing in. He said, Mike, Galligan had nothing to do with this, you know. And Mike's comment was to me, well, go to your office, you're stupid anyway. Well, the next day, Haverty and I have to fly to New York in a private plane together, and I was really looking forward to that trip. Well, it's like two little boys in a tub, you know. He's all happy for the whole trip. I mean, he was a tough character, but he had a heart of gold too. And he's been great for the city of Kansas City, owns a good part of the Royals. And Doremus had one thing, he gave all this money away to hospitals, to philanthropic organizations, but he would always say one thing, he said, I make one demand of you when I'm giving you money. Never give me any credit or never give my company any credit for this, because this is not business. This is what should be done. And basically that was Haverty's view. And that was the culture which we kept for so many years. Now, it's already changed. As I write at the end of the book, it's over. You know, it's now history. The culture is no longer. CPKC is the new company. And to be fair, you know, after getting Mexico, our track is now like 6,000 miles. Well, it's still mine. Even the new CPKC is 20,000. It's still the smallest Class 1 railroad. But you can't be quite as open-minded. You can't be, anyone could have gone into our CEOs, whether it be Haverty, whether it was Doremus, whether it was Ottensmeyer, the last one, and sit down and talk. Mostly they would come to my office and just sit down and talk. And if somebody was in my office, either the person working for me or somebody from another department, talking, they would naturally say, oh, get up, and the CEO was there. And inevitably, the CEO would sit there. And then oftentimes we'd talk business with other people, you know, maybe 3 or 4 levels down. It was just the way business happened there. It's changed, but maybe it has to change because it's a bigger company with different responsibilities. Anyway, the book goes into it. The book's much more interesting. The book goes into all of it and much, much more about the Mexican. One last story, and then I'll talk to you about, or entertain questions. When I was doing the book, I went back to Mexico to talk to 2 people. Jose Zazaya was the head of our Mexican railroad, and Vicente Corta, who I dedicate the book to, was our lawyer down there. He was actually a White & Case's New York law firm, but he was Mexican. Both of them were incredibly great people, nice people, funny people, very intelligent people. And we went out to dinner, and it was a great dinner, it lasted for like 3 hours, telling me stories about how we won the concession in Mexico, and the characters involved, the Mexican characters involved primarily. And I meant to, I've run over, but one of the reasons we were able to buy out our partners there, they had a ship, and their ship was found to have like 200,000 tons, or a huge amount of tons of cocaine. And they got into some problems, and it ended up eventually we got able to buy, although it was a ridiculous situation. Anyway, there was some shady business, let's face it, down there with things. And they were telling me stories, and I was laughing, and I was walking out at the end, and I said, this has been great, I can't use all the stuff you told me. And they both looked at me and said, you can't use anything. I said, they won't just get you, they'll get your family. And my comment was, yeah, it wasn't that interesting anyway. But it was kind of wild times. Anyway, it was a company that started with nothing, but through hard work and the fact that we just weren't focused on all getting rich, really did very well for itself.